Welcome back to the Evolving Warfighter for the third part in the series, A Leader's Guide for Addressing Suicide. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the devastating effects of cognitive dissonance and moral injuries among our soldiers. Cognitive dissonance can be the source of great emotional and cognitive stress. It occurs when an individual holds two conflicting ideas to be true at the same time. The stress of cognitive dissonance continues to occur until the conflict is resolved and one of the two beliefs is discarded. It is unfortunate that U.S. military has several cognitive dissonances built in its training program. This is done mainly to ensure that soldiers can survive the stress of the modern battlefield. However, coming back home and reintegrating into the civilian world can be extremely difficult if these cognitive dissonances are not addressed. The value systems that we use on the battlefield are not the same ones that can be applied in a garrison environment or when we transition back into the civilian life. And it's one of the biggest responsibilities of a leader is to ensure that your soldiers understand the value systems they're operating on, when to push themselves and when not to. Cognitive dissonances can occur both inside the military context and in the civilian world, and I'll give you a couple examples. My example from the civilian world comes from my experience as a father. Having served as a National Guard soldier, I had two sons that were both born in the month of July. This is a time of year where annual training is often scheduled. I found myself in a situation where my boys were around the ages of 12 and 11 when I realized that I had only attended a few of their birthdays out of the, 12 years they were alive. This caused me much distress. I thought to myself, a good father would always attend and celebrate their son's birthday party. It's a reasonable belief. But this one idea does not define what a good father is. I also believe the good father always provided for his family and took care of their children. So I had to take a look at both of these conflicting ideas and come to understand which one is more true and abandon the other. So eventually I realized that even though I didn't have the opportunity to always celebrate my son's birthday on their actual birthday with them, as long as I celebrated their birthday on some time before or after their birthday, I was still fulfilling the role of a good father, and as I also provided all the support they needed to meet their basic needs. The military example I have from you comes from my experience as a medic and working in the AMED community. It comes from the warrior ethos. How many times in basic training do we repeat the soldier creed? It's a quite often experience for modern soldiers. Inside the warrior ethos, we find the phrase, "We'll never leave a fallen soldier." However, on the actual battlefield, if we actually have wounded, we ask our medics, or our 68 whiskeys, to sort individuals by their likelihood to survive the battle. One of those categories is the expectant category, or the category where we expect those soldiers to die before they have the opportunity to be evac'd. Individuals are sorted into this category to ensure that the other individuals have the most likelihood to survive. But however, this puts the medic in a terrible situation because they have been reciting and internalizing this belief that they will never leave anyone behind, but yet an officer just asked them to identify those that should be left behind. If the officer doesn't take the time to explain either before this occurs or especially after it occurs that these two belief systems cannot exist simultaneously, it can cause incredible stress to that medic as they blame themselves for not living up to, what I would call an unreasonable standard. This cognitive dissonance also occurs in the thought that inside the warrior ethos we say we'll never quit. This is a great value to have in combat. If soldiers are wounded in combat, we need them to quickly throw on a tourniquet, apply buddy aid, and get back into the fight. If they have to walk for miles on bloodshot feet, we need them to do that so they can survive the battlefield and make it back to someplace safe. However, if we take that same soldier and put them in a garrison environment on, say, a 20-mile road march, if their feet become entirely blistered, the last thing we want to do is tell that soldier they can never quit to the point where they injure themselves in training to make themselves non-combat available for deployment. It becomes counterintuitive. Therefore, the concept of "I will never quit" has to have limitations in a garrison environment. This is also true about the civilian environment when they reintegrate back into civilian life. They cannot carry the harsh values of the U.S. Army teaches them back into civilian life after they transition out of the Army or retire, because it simply is not congruent with the rest of their values and the reality that they now find themselves in. If we're upfront and we talk to our soldiers about these conflicts, we can explain what value systems to use and what applications. And we can also warn them about some cognitive dissonances they may occur on the battlefield or while transitioning back home. This may help limit the distress that these soldiers encounter while dealing with actions that may not be congruent with the absolute standards of not leaving a soldier behind, not quitting, and always carrying on the battlefield. The cartoonist Travis Landchild of Stick Vet was kind enough to allow me to use one of his cartoons in this video. This individual worked for over 10 years inside Army mental health, and he has an exceptional way of catching some of these cognitive dissonances in his cartoons and the negative effects that they have on veterans. If you haven't checked out stickvet.com, I encourage everyone to do so. While I believe that most military leaders are familiar with the concept of post-traumatic stress, I do not believe many are knowledgeable or familiar with the concept of a moral injury. Just to summarize, post-traumatic stress is a series of maladaptive behaviors that occur after an individual feels that their life is threatened or witnesses another life being threatened, or at least severe bodily harm being threatened or occurring to another individual. Just like post-traumatic stress, moral injury shares a lot of these maladaptive behaviors and symptoms. Unlike post-traumatic stress, where you fear for your life or the life of others, moral injuries occur when you engage in an activity that violates one of your key moral standards. This can have a devastating impact on an individual as their concept of their self deravels. In essence, since they violated one value, they do not believe who they are as a person and may soon abandon all other values that they hold. The U.S. military may be exceptionally prone to moral injuries due to the evolution of human warfare. If we look at most species that have hierarchy dominance traits among males, when males come into conflict, they will fight, but at a certain level, one opponent will admit defeat, and at which time the fight will end and dominance will be established. It is very rare in nature to find a male dominant hierarchy system that requires one male to kill another male in combat. This may be due to the evolutionary drive that if you kill your own species, the species has a very low likelihood to continue on through multiple generations. This protective trait was noticed in World War II. It was noted that a sizable percentage of soldiers would actually not shoot to kill the enemy, choosing to shoot around or above the enemy's heads. Through the years, the U.S. military has developed different targets and different methods to ensure that soldiers are more instinctually driven to shoot to kill individuals. In the Second World War, soldiers were trained in marksmanship, shooting at bullseye targets. After World War II, the shape of targets were shifted to human silhouettes. This caused soldiers to become more accustomed at shooting at the shapes of humans. It became more instinctual. As soldiers arrived in combat in Vietnam and later wars, the percentage of soldiers that were engaging targets dramatically increased because soldiers were instinctively shooting at shapes that they were familiar with the concept of targets. Essentially, they were seeing the shape of a human and understanding it to be a target and not a human. While this is an effective way of increasing the amount of damage that can be done to an enemy force and having a much more destructive military, it did not prepare the soldiers themselves to handle the moral injury of killing another human being. While killing might be the most dramatic moral injury, there are several other moral injuries that occur on the battlefield whenever an individual's moral standards is compromised. In my experience, before I joined the military, I was a paramedic. I would come to the rescue of anyone that called 911. It didn't matter your ability to pay the bill, your race, your religion, your creed, it just didn't matter. Call 911 and we would come to your rescue. However, being a platoon leader in Iraq in charge of a ground ambulance company, treatment protocols were extremely difficult. Now, when I arrived on scene, I had to ask, how is this person injured? If this person is a contractor, do they have a signed agreement to compensate the military for the services rendered in saving this individual's life? Become much more complex, and my moral standard of delivering care to everyone that asked was violated. A book I often recommend on this channel is Achilles in Vietnam. Dr. Jonathan Shea spent many years treating PTSD victims from Vietnam, and he realized that over and over and over again he was hearing the actual stories of Achilles during the Trojan War. It's a rather fascinating book as he explains moral injuries and has basically side-by-side comparisons of quotes taken from Vietnam veterans and actual passages of the Iliad, or the story of the Trojan War. I recommend that every leader have a chance to read that book because it explains the rapid deterioration of moral characters that can occur after a moral injury. A once great leader can quickly dissolve into a berserker. If you have an individual experiencing moral injuries, it is critical that you provide support. It is not enough just to treat the symptoms of that moral injury, but actually address the underlying cause. This may be helpful to call on things such as the Chaplain Corps to discuss this moral injury in greater detail. One book that personally helped me after my experiences in the Iraq War was Karl von Clausewitz on War. He begins by explaining that there is actually no morality in warfare, and it is simply an extension of politics. It was only after I read his passage that I become to understand that the hope of maintaining morality inside warfare may be impossible. While we may make our best attempts to remain a moral force fighting for positive reasons, there are situations that will force us to choose between violating one moral standard or another. And once we arrive at this situation, we need to have effective techniques to understand that we can address these moral conflicts and come to some type of resolution. This may require us to restructure our moral beliefs or come to terms with the fact that it may have been impossible to maintain all our moral beliefs in a combat zone. Like I said earlier, almost no other species on Earth has a hierarchy mechanism that requires the killing of another male. The act of modern warfare itself may be an extreme moral conflict in itself. So anyone that enters that domain and may be forced with the challenge of killing others should ultimately be aware that they are almost destined to receive a moral injury. As always, thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. Again, I invite you to take a look at the works of Travis Landchild. I'll leave a video of his here, and I wish him well in his mission of taking care of our veteran community. As I invite you to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter for more episodes on the topic of suicide and on the topics of Army self-development. I will leave you today with a list of videos that I find useful when dealing with the topic of suicide ideation. As always, focus on your self-development so we can ensure that we can dominate the modern battlefield.